Welcome back. My name is Corey. I know and recognize many of you from previous gatherings. Nice to see you again. I am here to introduce Jerry Flexer. He is visiting us from British Columbia, Canada, and I've had the pleasure of working with Jerry since about 2016 as a researcher conducting research in our archive. Jerry has been studying the work of Krishnamurti for many years and is currently engaged in a doctoral research program that's focusing on the sort of historical reading of those who were around and influenced by Krishnamurti in the middle to late 20th century. So with that, I would like you to join me in welcoming Jerry.
Thank you, Corey. Thanks for that. It's been a pleasure working with you over the years, too. I've had fantastic help. Can everyone hear okay? No? Louder? Louder? Better now? So, yes, I am from Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. And I'll just say before I get into my presentation, I'm experiencing a series of firsts for me in these past few days. For example, on Thursday, I made a new friend as I arrived at the airport in Los Angeles, and I discovered something wonderful. A first for me. I understood that this place can be known as the Nest, which is what Ojai apparently means in an indigenous language. And I must say, I also feel I feel in a number of ways like I am in a nest. There's just a great deal of love around here, and wonderful people, and friendly people. So I'm just so privileged to be with you, and thank you, and welcome all of you to the nest as well. So my topic has to do with thinking about how we can live, with how we can use choiceless awareness in living the teachings. So this sort of builds on what David Moody talked about this morning, but from a different perspective. But you may find some parallels, some differences. Keep that in mind, and we'll see what you think. So, to let you know what it is that I'm planning to do for this session, I want to divide it into three parts. In the first part, I'm going to take some of my academic learning and other experiential learning that I've done in my research with Krishnamurti's teachings, and give you some a bit of an introduction to some commentary I've encountered. Just some selected, both Krishnamurti commentators and also academics as well. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how I feel right now about this whole notion of living the teachings with choiceless awareness. And the last part, I'm going to introduce something that I hope you find interesting as I find it. It's a question. A question I still hold in my mind. Does Krishnamurti present us with an impossible challenge? Or is it possible? So I found this dedication to Krishnamurti in one of the yoga books that I have in my home that I've had for 20 years, but I only discovered it just at about the same time that I was preparing this particular presentation, so I thought I would share it with you, because I have also learned just recently how to be a better yoga student. And I attribute it mainly to what I've discovered in Krishnamurti's teachings, which I thought was pretty cool because it has to do with the body. So this is by Desikachar in his book, The Heart of Yoga, Developing a Personal Practice. So the first topic is the art of living. And I've just got, I'll be relying a great deal on Krishnamurti quotes, just because I like to go to the source mostly. This comes from one of Krishnamurti's letters to the schools from 1979. He was asked a question, what do you consider to be one of the most important things in life? And he says, perhaps it is the art of living. So I found that pretty interesting. It's interesting that he chose to use the word art, which is a good notion for us to be aware of. And the response of the questioner to Krishnamurti's notion of life, living as an art, is also very interesting. Aren't you asking too much? We'll see what you think about that as we go along. So, to give you some idea of what some others have had to say about the notion of choiceless awareness, and as David Moody indicated this morning, for those of you who were here, this is considered very much a phrase that's attributed to Krishnamurti as an original phrase. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the commentary on choiceless awareness is, and then I'm going to try and relate it, also again a little bit like David Moody did, to some other Krishnamurti concepts, to give you an impression of how things fit together as a whole, which might be a better way to look at Krishnamurti teachings and choiceless awareness instead of considering choiceless awareness separately. So the first commentary that I'd like to share with you is by Evelyn Blau, who was a close associate of Krishnamurti's and is the creator, together with Michael Mendiza, of a 12-part video series on Krishnamurti, where one part 5, it's a video series, is directly about choiceless awareness. So from that, Evelyn Blau asks, what does it mean, or is asking, what does it mean to be aware from moment to moment? Most of us have a distinctive awareness of our likes and dislikes. There is a sharp division between the two, our likes and dislikes. And she's asking, is it possible to just be aware? To leave like and dislike behind and simply see things as they are. Those times, Blau says, in which awareness is far beyond the mere focus of concentration, what we're focusing on, Krishnamurti calls that choiceless awareness. As he has said, Krishnamurti, of course, when you are very clear, there is no choice. It is a subject that he returned to over and over throughout his talks, also as David mentioned this morning. So it's a very, very important, at least certainly in Krishnamurti's mind, to the whole of the teachings and to understanding the teachings. So the next person who is a Krishnamurti commentator and associate, who is an editor of some of his material and wrote the introduction to his book, To Be Human, is David Skitt. And from that introduction, David Skitt writes that there is an imaginary observer who separates himself or herself from what he was experiencing, and that creates a source of endless conflict both within oneself and also with others. And indeed, collectively, among groups of people or even nations. What Skitt says is that when these separative thoughts and images arise, one should stay with them. Not escaping, not condemning or justifying. Again, we hear the same kinds of words that David mentioned this morning were very, very much associated with choiceless awareness. So not seeking to change or get rid of them, but, and here's a quote from Krishnamurti, holding them like a baby with care. And in this choiceless awareness, there is an observing without the observer, and the thoughts and images subside. This is my first opportunity to point something out about the language of Krishnamurti that presents a significant challenge, certainly at least to me. At first look of these words, that with the use of choiceless awareness, the thoughts and images will altogether subside. I have to sort of have a question there and just ask myself if that's not a challenge to arrive at a state that is pretty difficult to do. It does seem difficult to me. In other words, can we imagine that in choiceless awareness, thoughts and images about conflict simply subside? I don't know. I'm not sure. So, Hilary Rodrigue is a fellow Canadian who is a scholar. So now we're moving a bit away from commentators, generally, to academics who have engaged with Krishnamurti directly. Hilary Rodrigue, when talking about Krishnamurti's awareness and choiceless awareness, says that awareness is passive observation of what is. So he's connecting awareness and passive awareness with the idea of what is, which also is a very common phrase and term that Krishnamurti uses. And in Rodrigue's view, it also has to do with being alert to the movement of what is. Of course, what is changes all the time. So choiceless awareness involves a continuous flow of engagement. What Rodrigue is saying about what Krishnamurti says is that to understand ourselves truly, we must be passively aware without choice. Choice represents psychological confusion. So I like to mention and point out that the idea here is we're talking about the psychology and the mind and how that works. And that takes us back to the idea of self-knowledge and self-understanding. Now, Aldous Huxley talks about choiceless awareness in the foreword that he wrote to the book The First and Last Freedom by Krishnamurti. And he says that there is a transcendent spontaneity of life, a kind of creative reality that penetrates the ego and the subconscious. And again, this is another challenge of Krishnamurti's choiceless awareness. How, I can ask myself, am I to become aware of what's in my subconscious? To me, it sounds like a significant challenge, especially if I'm encouraged to do it moment to moment. But for Krishnamurti, as Huxley points out, choiceless awareness is the only effective meditation. So here we have a connection between choiceless awareness and meditation. It's a different way. So Krishnamurti put this slant on the popular notion of meditation that is, of course, unique to Krishnamurti. And Constance Jones is another academic who wrote about Krishnamurti in 2015. And for Jones, the way she looks at Krishnamurti's choiceless awareness is she says that true meditation is a continual inquiry based on awareness and attentiveness. In her view, Krishnamurti calls this freedom from the known and choiceless awareness. So we have, again, meditation connected with choiceless awareness and the notion of freedom from the known, which presents us with another challenge, but it's a very interesting connection made by Jones. Now, Daniel Goleman is an American psychologist who's the creator of the idea of emotional intelligence. He's also written about Krishnamurti. And this is what he has to say about Krishnamurti's choiceless awareness. It's about experiencing what is without giving it a name. And it's completely beyond thought. Because thought comes from the past, but meditation is always in the present. So again, I selected this to help point out how, looking at the words, I think that I could probably get a decent understanding of the language, verbally and intellectually, but I may have a challenge in being in that always in the present. And then Goleman quotes Krishnamurti, "Watch what you're thinking. Be in a state of mind that you're able to perceive the ways of your own mind. Look and be simple. Where there is attention, without reactive thought, that's how you identify reality. Where there is attention, without reactive thought." Again, this is just interesting, but can be quite a challenge to put into effect. Now, I don't know if many of you have heard of Abraham Maslow, but this morning David was speaking about self-actualization, and that is something that Maslow popularized in the 70s. Maslow read one of Krishnamurti's books, and he wrote a short essay about it. And his impression of what choicely aware meant to him was that it means to accept the experience or the other person. So here, Maslow is adding something new to the whole equation, and that's not just the experience, but another person that you're encountering. So it's connected with Krishnamurti's idea of relationship. But the notion that Maslow gets from Krishnamurti's choiceless awareness is that it's about being able to respect and enjoy and appreciate the other person in a passive accepting and yielding way. I just don't have the last word there. So that's the first part of what I wanted to share with you, is how some other folks who have interpreted Krishnamurti's teachings, and especially that aspect that is choiceless awareness, how they integrate choiceless awareness with so many different other concepts. Just like David was saying this morning, there's a whole that is what Krishnamurti was talking about, that requires us maybe to look at the big picture rather than fragments such as choiceless awareness. Although it's a key and significant term, it's one part of the whole. So, how do I read choiceless awareness? I'll just give you a little bit of that, and I'm again, like I'm no expert, and I don't necessarily have any particularly valuable approach, but I'll share it with you anyway. And then I want to share some ideas about different connections between choiceless awareness and other concepts that are very key to Krishnamurti. So I don't even notice, but there are a number of groups that are very active on YouTube that are Krishnamurti groups. And, it's got a point, I think. Sorry. One of the ones that I thought was really interesting was this one. Awareness is silent and choiceless. So it's silent is something new. This is a quote from Krishnamurti. And it's silent and choiceless, in which comparison and judgment have ceased. It's just a different language that Krishnamurti used to describe his notion of what kind of awareness is choiceless. Now, one thing that I discovered while I was doing my master's work on Krishnamurti as it relates to education and dialogue is the notion of insight and how it might be connected to choiceless awareness. So Krishnamurti says that insight is to see into the movement of thought, not by analysis and not applying some intellectual capacity. Also, it's not the result of any kind of knowledge, but it has to do with perceiving something instantly. And when he was asked at a 1979 public talk, what do you mean by insight? Krishnamurti explained, the word insight means to see into things, into the whole movement of thought, not by analysis or intellectual capacity, not by knowledge. Then the question, of course, arises, well, what is insight? If it's to perceive something instantly, how does it connect with choiceless awareness? And the idea is that Krishnamurti wants us to realize that once we have an insight into the fact of what is, what immediately follows from that is action. It doesn't result in inaction, but it results in action, which means that we can have an important connection between choiceless awareness and insight and action. We'll add more and more terms. So an example from Krishnamurti that he recorded in 1983, he said that watching and listening are a great art. Watching without reaction, when there is this simple, clear watching and listening, there is an awareness. That leads to an awareness without choice. To be aware without any like or dislike. When one is attentive to all this choicelessly, then out of that comes insight. So, for example, many of us, Krishnamurti says, have experienced childhood hurts. And what's happened is that we've created an image of something that happened a long time ago, and that image stays with us. And what Krishnamurti is saying, that so long as that image stays with us, that hurt stays with us also. But what he's suggesting is that when you have an insight in that whole activity of the mind, where that image is still there and the hurt is still there, when you perceive that instantly, directly, according to Krishnamurti, to perceive it instantly, the hurt can be dissolved. Now we're talking about psychology and a psychological hurt. And again, it's just a situation where we're looking at Krishnamurti's teachings, and I look at it and I understand the importance and the value of what Krishnamurti is saying. When I relate it to my everyday life, I still find it somewhat challenging to note how having an insight into the image and the hurt will dissolve the hurt. It's a difficult thing for me to be able to comprehend and assimilate. This is a quote from Krishnamurti from 1974 in a discussion he had with Alan Anderson. He says, to be aware without any choice, regardless of what people say about me. So he's saying they can flatter me, they can hurt me, they can offend me, But if I'm able to be aware and observe what people say and just watch it without yielding or resisting or wanting to change anything or reacting, if I can be that sensitive, that is an example of choiceless watching. Also something that is hard for me to do sometimes. I sometimes respond defensively when someone criticizes me or indicates to me that I've done something wrong. It's pretty hard for me to be choicelessly watching. Another quote from Krishnamurti that I feel is relevant is this connection between self-knowledge and choiceless awareness and relationships. So we see how Krishnamurti is making that connection between these different expressions that are all very important in his teachings. And of course, the relationship to the connection with relationships is especially important. And this has to do with self-knowledge. Krishnamurti says that without understanding oneself, there cannot be order in the world. Like David was talking about, you are the world. Without exploring the whole process of thought, feeling, and action in oneself, there cannot possibly be order, peace, and security in the world. Therefore, to study oneself is of primary importance. And Krishnamurti just tells us that it doesn't involve inaction. On the contrary, it requires extraordinary awareness in everything that one does, awareness in which there is no judgment, no condemnation or blame, but to be aware of the total process of oneself as one lives in daily life. And so this just gets me back to the idea of living the teachings. This whole thing is, the way I see it, I read it not so much as an opportunity to reflect philosophically on what might be possible, but to reflect on how we might apply what Krishnamurti has to say in our daily life. Another connection that Krishnamurti makes between different expressions that he uses in his teachings is between freedom and choiceless awareness. So we have the notion, and a quote by Krishnamurti from the core of the teachings, something he dictated in 1980. He said that freedom is pure observation, without direction, without motive, and freedom is found in choiceless awareness of our daily existence. Again, what I want to point out is this whole idea of daily existence. I think the way I read Krishnamurti is it's all about how we can change, but also how we apply what he encourages us to do in our daily life. It's about our daily existence. It's about awareness, moment to moment. Unconditional surrender to what is, without rationalization, without division of observer and observed. And I like this quote because it adds to my contention that while this makes a great deal of sense to me as to how to change, to live a more beneficial and productive life and in peace in the world and in my relationships, is with choiceless awareness. But the idea that is a little bit harder for me to grasp is this notion of the division between observer and observed. I can relate to it, but I need to really ask myself, am I relating to it on a verbal level, intellectually, or do I really know how to live without division between observer and observed? I find that somewhat challenging. Now we have a connection that Krishnamurti draws between conflict and choiceless awareness. He says that one of the many ways of escaping conflict is to condemn it, to justify it, to suppress it, or sublimate it, to find a substitute for it. But if we do not do any of these things, but merely live with it, be passively aware, choicelessly aware, then the conflict itself will unfold its meaning. It will reveal its content. Sorry. It will reveal its content. The conflict will reveal to us what it's about at its core. And only when the content of conflict is revealed is there freedom from conflict. I can relate to that in a way, because I've had experiences where I feel like I have had an insight into that process, and that has helped me deal with conflict better. But I still think it's quite challenging. The notion of realizing that when I have an insight into what the conflict is all about, when it reveals its content to me, that is in some way a way for me to become free of that conflict. And then there's the connection between relationship and choiceless awareness. So Krishnamurti, for example, asked at one of his talks, but what is the true significance of relationship? Is it not a process of self-revelation? Is not revelation is not relationship a mirror in which, if we are aware, we can observe without distortion our private thoughts and motives, our inward state? In a relationship, the process of the self, of the ego, is revealed through choiceless awareness alone, and is revealed through choiceless awareness, and alone can give us an indication of what's going on in our own minds. Once it can be transcended, conflict ceases, and we arrive at a transcending kind of state of mind that actually approaches his idea of what love is. Love has no motive, and so we have a connection here between relationship, awareness, observing our inward state in a relationship, and the self is revealed through choiceless awareness, and eventually we're led to this notion of love. So a number of different expressions and terms that are connected. What Krishnamurti says is needed is choiceless awareness. And this leads us to Krishnamurti's notion of the quiet mind. Choiceless awareness and the quiet mind, another of those Krishnamurti expressions that connect to form what I referred to earlier as this one whole approach that blends together, even though it relies on many different terms. Choiceless awareness of all escapes is needed so that the mind becomes completely quiet. So another connection that I found in my readings of Krishnamurti's, a connection between choiceless awareness and self-knowledge, but one even more interesting is that Krishnamurti here is concerned with both the conscious as well as unconscious aspects of the mind. And so he says, see the world as it is. Don't translate it in terms of your concept. See it as it is, violent, brutal, whatever it is, good or beautiful. There must be an observation of myself as I am, without saying how terrible, how ugly, how beautiful. I must see this way myself. I must see myself, the hypocrisy, the tricks I play, the whole of that activity of the mind and the different ways that we all relate to the world. He says, watchfulness without any choice, just watch. I know myself, knowing myself all the time. So to me, reading this, it seems that we have Krishnamurti encouraging us to see ourselves in a way that presents, in my reading, a serious challenge. How hard is it, the way I see it, to actually be aware of my unconscious? It just seems like a significant challenge to me. But that's what Krishnamurti encourages. One of the ways we can look at Krishnamurti's teachings and what different aspects of it mean is by looking at it negatively. So one has to be aware without contention, passively, alertly aware of our envy, our jealousy, our greed, violence. But once we become aware, passively aware or choicelessly aware, without contending with it, without trying to explain it or change, all these things drop away. It's challenging. In my experience, it's been challenging to me. One of the ways Krishnamurti describes awareness is that it's a quality of mind. We see a connection here between choiceless awareness as a quality of mind. And we also see a connection with freedom again. But what I find interesting here also is that Krishnamurti himself suggests, that this is rather difficult. He says, awareness is this quality of mind which observes without any justification or condemnation, approval or disapproval. Like or dislike merely observes. And it is rather difficult when emotionally you are stirred up. So Krishnamurti here concedes this whole idea that in this kind of situation, it is a difficult thing to do if there's an emotional component to the experience. It's very difficult to have that quality of mind that can observe and be aware without justifying. Another thing that awareness is not, is it's not learning, it's not an act of will, but it's an endless discovery of who we are, and it requires constant inquiry. It is an awareness with no choice, but has nothing. It's not something we can learn or concentrate on. It's just a discovery that continues from moment to moment. Krishnamurti says you can come to that state of awareness, which is meditation, only when there is no condemnation, no effort of suppression or control. It's an awareness in which there is no choice, because choice implies an effort, in which turn implies domination and control. And you can't have that and be choiceless. It's challenging, but it makes complete sense. It's just that it is challenging. Krishnamurti also says, are you not in conflict? If you are, do you not search out its cause? The cause is the self with its desires. To struggle with these desires only creates resistance, further pain. But if you are choicelessly aware of your craving, your desires, then there comes creative understanding. It is the truth of this understanding that liberates, not your struggle against resistance to envy, anger, pride, and so on. So, yes, very important and something very significant in Krishnamurti's teachings, but also quite challenging, at least for me. It's not introspection. We looked at that also this morning. Introspection is looking within. So if I discover that I am angry, and I look inside with introspection to try and become not angry, that's a different kind of awareness in Krishnamurti's view. What awareness is entirely different. It's observation without condemnation. It's also not self-improvement. Awareness is not about becoming something better, a better person. But actually, Krishnamurti says it has to do with the ending of the self. He says in awareness, there is no self-improvement. Makes sense to me, but again, this is a bit challenging for me also because we're using the words ending of the self. And it's another part of Krishnamurti's teachings that I find challenging. This notion of the self is something that is very hard for me in my day-to-day life to overcome. And maybe I can do it occasionally, but it's pretty hard to live that way in that kind of state or way of being. Krishnamurti says that to watch is to observe without choice, to see yourself as you are without any movement of desire to change, which is an extremely arduous thing to do. Krishnamurti actually says that. But it doesn't mean that you are going to remain in your present state. There may be a change. You do not know what will happen if you see yourself as you are without wishing to bring about a change. So there's reluctance and resistance to allowing yourself to stay within that choiceless awareness of seeing yourself as you are. You want to change it, and you resist that. But Krishnamurti is telling us that really, the only way to get out of that is to allow it to unfold with choiceless awareness. He even concedes that it's extremely arduous to do, which I find really interesting. He was asked the question, what is one to do if one suffers pain? This is an interesting example for me because we're talking about physical pain. And I hadn't thought before that choiceless awareness could be something that could be useful and applied in the area of physical pain and fear, rather than more to do with psychology. But there's of course a connection because of fear and physical pain. So he was asked, what is one to do if one suffers pain? Just be aware of that pain, he says. Be choicelessly aware of that fact. You maybe will still have pain nonetheless because that is what is happening in your life. But at least you won't be carrying forward to tomorrow and the next day the fear about it. Because you have that pain and you're thinking, well, I'll be better in a few days, I'll be better next week. And in the meantime, that fear of that future pain continues to affect what is happening to you in your life and in your mind. There's no fear in it, though you have the pain. If you're choicelessly aware of the fact, the fear at least won't be there. So what I wanted to do with those examples is just to suggest that as much love as I have for Krishnamurti's teachings, and as much as I like to consider myself not just a Krishnamurti scholar, but also a Krishnamurti practitioner of sorts, like sort of my yoga practice, a lot of it is really challenging. I find it challenging. And I just posed the question, is it a possible or an impossible challenge? And many of us will have to relate differently in our responses and how we live that. But I offer the possibility of an image of seeing Krishnamurti's teachings as a kind of fulcrum or a lever into the teachings, a way in, somehow, into this idea of the art of living the teachings. So what do I mean by this notion of possible or impossible challenge? Here is Krishnamurti in one particular talk coaxing the audience. I hope you are actually doing this with me as we go along and are not just verbally accepting what is being said. There's a challenge here. There's something about the way that we encounter language and respond to it using our own mind and language and thought. And there's something that Krishnamurti is encouraging us to do, and that is to go beyond that. Can we go beyond that? Not just verbally accepting what he is saying, but actually do it. Are you actually doing this? And he also says there is a total change, and I've highlighted the word total here, when the observer is the observed, when that division between observer and observed evaporates. What I found interesting about this quote is this use of the word total. Does that mean there can be a partial change? So as challenging as the teachings may be to live in daily life, and whether it's an impossible challenge or a possible challenge, perhaps if I see here that Krishnamurti is using the word total change, perhaps there is a possibility of partial change. For example, I'm not sure that I really have a good grasp of being able to be without the division of observer and observed. But I think I have a pretty good grasp of conditioning, for example. I like to think I have an open mind and that I've realized and become aware of many of my conditioning influences and have managed to allow them to not influence me so much. But in my unconscious, there must be some other conditioning influences that I'm just not aware of, and they may still be having an impact on how I live my daily life. Krishnamurti at one point in one talk asked the audience, "Why don't you change? What prevents you from changing? Why haven't you changed?" So he's coaxing his audience to ask the question of yourself. See what kind of answer you come up with. It's quite the challenge. So in fact, I think that Krishnamurti is challenging us in a way. It's change that he'd like to encourage us to go through, but it is challenging to do. It might be arduous, but there might be a way to get into this, at least to get to some kind of partial change, perhaps. Begin very simply, we call this. What I like about this particular part of Krishnamurti's teachings in this quote is the use of the word begin. If there's a way to begin, then there's a first step that all of us can take. And that I find encouraging. It's challenging, but it is encouraging. There is a way to begin. He says, right thinking comes with self-knowledge. Begin very simply. Begin to be aware of your thoughts, feelings. Try to understand them. Try to get behind them ever more deeply and widely. There is a process. I'll continue the quote. Understanding is prevented if you judge or compare, accept or deny. And since the mind is ever doing this, try to find out why it is so conditioned. Note the use of the word try. Try to find out. I do that. But there's still some trying involved here, which means Krishnamurti encourages us to try. It's a challenge. And he's encouraging us to break through that conditioning. It may be challenging, but we can try to break through that conditioning. So what's my takeaway from all this? I love Krishnamurti's teachings, and I'm always looking for ways to apply Krishnamurti's teachings in my day-to-day life, but I've also have this sense of this being very challenging. I find it challenging to be choicelessly aware as a way to be. So what do I take away from all this? Well, I try, like Krishnamurti says, I try to see with choiceless awareness. And occasionally, sometimes I might have an insight and find a way to live that is consistent with my own, this is my own understanding of Krishnamurti's teachings. And perhaps this might be a way in, kind of a fulcrum, a lever, into the whole of Krishnamurti's teachings. So what do I do? Personally, what does Jerry Flexer do? This isn't all I do, but this is part of what I do. I try to understand the teachings, challenging as they may be. But I have recognized that it's an ongoing, continual inquiry into who I am and how I relate to others and what's going on in my mind. It continues from moment to moment. I try to do it with choiceless awareness, or my understanding of choiceless awareness, as challenging as that is. It's an arduous challenge, but still, there's an art to it. There's something creative about that process, the way I see it. The way choiceless awareness works in Krishnamurti's teachings is that it's one of Krishnamurti's unique expressions and terms about how to live the teachings that is part of a collection of terms that combine all together to make a whole living approach. So what I try to do is not to look at something like choiceless awareness or conditioning as part of the teachings and try to understand that part. But I know that I need to continue to go into the different components in order to try to live a whole living approach, to see the big picture of Krishnamurti's teachings. I need to remind myself that Krishnamurti was extraordinary, a remarkable human being. And I don't have to remind myself that I'm not. So I have my limitations, both in intellectual capacity and understanding everything I encounter. But Krishnamurti was extraordinary. And he spoke from his own experience. And all I can do is speak and understand the world from my own experience. And you have your own experience. So for me, choiceless awareness, I realize that choiceless awareness is not a state that I can be in all the time. And if I'm lucky, it's a small part, but maybe over time it will encompass a larger and larger component of how I live. Krishnamurti said, in giving an example in one of his talks, when I am no longer wasting energy saying, what am I to do? In other words, discouraging us from asking ourselves, what should I do? When we're not wasting energy trying to resolve that, then I'm left with a tremendous amount of other energy to do other things. I learn as I meet the challenge, as I go along. So this I like, because the notion here is that I learn as I meet the challenge as I go along. Sure, insights happen instantaneously. It's immediate perception. But the idea of choiceless awareness and self-knowledge and the whole of the teachings, all of that can be learned as you go along, which I find the encouraging aspect of the challenging aspect of Krishnamurti's teachings. Krishnamurti, a story is recounted by a yoga teacher named Vanda Scaravelli, who hosted Krishnamurti in Italy for a number of years. And she wrote a book about yoga, in which she refers to Krishnamurti and his teachings in several different places. And she recounts a story Krishnamurti used to like to tell. And she says that Krishnamurti used to talk about the state of attention we should have in daily life. The kind of attention in daily life, you must always remember that you live shut up in a closet with a cobra. And the moment you're inattentive, the cobra will get you. It's challenging because I can't be like that all the time. It'd be pretty hard to be that way all the time. But that's the idea. If we can imagine that we live shut up in a closet with a cobra, if we can think that way, then we'll perhaps be encouraged to be attentive, to make sure the cobra doesn't get us. So, another interesting quote from Krishnamurti that I found on a Facebook group is, if you begin to understand what you are without trying to change it, then what you are undergoes a transformation. And my favorite word in this whole quote is begin. Again, there is a way to begin all this. So there's a challenge here in this language, because I don't know how the beginning to understand myself without trying to change it, that choiceless awareness, how that will lead to transformation. I just don't see it now. So I'm going to do like one of my friends once asked me, is how do you know that's going to work? Well, yeah, you don't. But I like to end with this, because at least the word begin is in there, and that means that we can all begin somewhere and also move away from where we are right now. Not becoming, not wanting or wishing to become somebody else or somebody better, but there is some place we can all begin and understand the teachings better. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Just asking if it's ready. Yeah. Okay, hi everyone. Yes, I can hear myself, yeah. Hi, well yes, thank you Jerry. I appreciate that presentation. We're opening this up. We have collected some questions from the audience watching online, and Leah is joining me here. So we'll have a little conversation about the presentation. We'll take some of these questions, and then we also have a microphone available for any questions that the audience here has. So one thing I thought would be interesting just to look at together was, I feel like one of the through lines throughout your presentation was this challenge that is the difference between learning and understanding in a verbal way Krishnamurti's teachings, and then this phrase, living the teachings, which is living in an applied way what one feels one has understood by reading and engaging in this work. So I wonder if there's anything that you could say about where you think the challenge is. What is so challenging about moving from a place of understanding something verbally to living and applying one's own understanding in one's life? Because I feel like I see this kind of happen in dialogues and in conversations. We can all sort of become immersed in exchanging words between one another. So yeah, I'm just curious, you mentioned this challenge quite a bit, to if there was a way to zoom in on that anymore and unpack that a bit.
I wish there was something that I could share that would apply to all of us, but of course we all have to find our own way into this challenge. But I think that one of the things that I've experienced in my own life is the connection between living the teachings and choiceless awareness and insight. And insight. So I see insight as an important aspect, but it's not something that can be cultivated. In my master's research work, I found a dialogue that Krishnamurti had with some students in California in 1981. And when I looked carefully at the transcript of this dialogue that Krishnamurti had with these students, I found an example of one of the students in the dialogue actually expressing an insight that had occurred to him or her at that moment. And so I found it very interesting the way that this was expressed. And I decided to use the title for my thesis for my master's work. I decided to call it Krishnamurti's Approach to Dialogue in Higher Education and Instigating Insight. I decided to refer to Krishnamurti in a radical kind of way as an instigator. Some have called him a revolutionary in the way of encouraging insight in people that he's dialoguing with. I refer to him as an instigator. And the expression from the student, while they were talking about part of Krishnamurti's, what I call Krishnamurti's curriculum as a teacher will have, whether he's talking about the material process of thought or time or something difficult, something challenging to comprehend, to understand. But eventually, towards the end of the talk, this was a talk of about an hour, the student, the transcript actually shows the student saying, "Oh, what you mean by so-and-so, and I don't remember the exact words, by this, by thought as a material process is this and that. I see, I understand that now." So I just focused in on the words "I see," because I thought that expression, "Oh, I see." There was a struggle with the challenge in the student's mind as that dialogue was happening, as Krishnamurti was engaging in the dialogue with the students. But eventually, at one particular moment, through no effort, through no cultivation or engagement of willpower or learning or knowledge of any kind, eventually something happened in the mind of the student when he or she had an insight into understanding a part of Krishnamurti's teaching. So, because we can't learn to do insight, at least I don't know how to do it, and we don't have another Krishnamurti in the world who's an insight instigator, this is something of a challenge for each of us to explore, to get into, and see if it comes about. I think that choiceless awareness and insight are so intimately connected. If there's a way for you to get into choiceless awareness and breaking through conditioning, then there's an opportunity to create a way to be that is open to insight. And that's pretty much, I think, all we can do, is to be available to insight when it comes like a bolt of lightning, or a flame of attention, or an arrow that sort of hits us. So, yeah, there's a challenge. There's no answer, I don't think, that I could help any particular individual with some kind, and certainly I'm not Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti might, will obviously have a better answer, but maybe there's a connection with insight, I think.
Right. Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure if you have any questions.
I had a question about, I noticed you put up the quote about total change. What's your view on this? I mean, I know that Kay says, change there is no such thing as partial change. In your view, in your studies, in your experience, is that an actual thing? Is there such thing as partial insight, or it's just, and you're totally changed?
It's a good question. And I think the best that I can do is share with you my own experience. That's pretty much all. I don't know what's going on in other people's minds, and I haven't really spent a lot of time talking with other people about something similar, but I'm happy to share with you my own inner sense. And my own inner sense is that partial transformation happens all the time. All the time for me. I had a telephone conversation with my sister a few months ago after sharing with my siblings that I discovered that people in the past had considered me rude, which I often am, and my apologies to anyone here who I've been rude to. But I discovered that, and I learned about it through feedback from others as a result of an experience on the job. It was hurtful at first, of course, but I of course, got a great deal of good feedback that led me to future learning. But when I was explaining all this to my sister on the phone, her first question was, she's a very practical person, so have you changed? In other words, so I had no idea what to say for several minutes, because in my mind I'm always changing. I'm never the same as I was yesterday. I don't know if I said at the beginning that I've had a whole bunch of first experiences. Did I remember to say that? I've had a lot of firsts in the past couple of days, so I'm always changing. That's my experience. And that's why it was hard for me to respond to my sister, because I thought she wanted to know if I made a choice, a decision, to no longer be rude. Do you see what I mean? But I'm already engaged in Krishnamurti's teachings, and I have this notion of choiceless awareness as a way in to trying to understand Krishnamurti's teachings. So I had great difficulty, because my sister knows nothing about Krishnamurti. So it was an interesting, sort of a funny kind of situation.
So are you saying that there was a difference between, saying to yourself, okay, I'm going to decide to not be rude anymore, versus actually seeing the implications of the behavior?
My first response was, and I use this word a lot, my apologies, I'm too old to be using this word, but I use wow a lot. Wow and cool. And I think my first response was, wow, this is interesting. Wow, I wish someone had shared that with me 10 years ago or whatever time. I think there was a time period when I was more rude than at other times. So, yeah, but that's my experience. And maybe that was an example of choiceless awareness that I was able to have an insight to just by accident. Yeah, that's an excellent question. It gives me a chance to review that whole. My response was, wow, this is interesting. And I didn't have that. Hey, I should, which is maybe another reason why I was so reluctant and took me so long to respond to my sister's question. So, and I must say, in my experience, I've probably had a few of those. I don't remember others, but in that case, yeah. Thank you for reminding me that insights like that come along occasionally.
So we have a question from the online audience that I'll read for you here. It says, Kay spoke of the energy needed for perception, awareness, transformation. For those prone to wasting energy in conflict, what does one do?
One would be advised to delve deeply into Krishnamurti's teachings and to try to understand them and to know and be encouraged that even though it's very challenging, if you try and if you begin somewhere at the beginning, without expectations, any motive, just being choicelessly aware of life as it happens to you, and occasionally saying, wow, this is interesting, maybe. Or you have your own thing about your response, but not to be reactive. I would recommend trying that. And something I like to say occasionally is, try it, see what happens. I know it's hard I've sometimes said that to people who are logical and have to have a reason for doing things and are concerned with cause and effect and proof and evidence and all that, but try it, see what happens.
I want to open it up also if there's any questions from the audience here. You're welcome to come to the mic here in the middle of the room.
I have a question that I think is related to the one that you just read. I love the possibility of choicelessness, but I wonder if we should set limits to it, thereby conserving the energy that we have for it. It seems to me that that there's a time in our life for real creativity. Krishnamurti called that explosive creativity one time, and that really struck me. But it seems to me that it's not quite possibly not possible and not necessary to do that all of the time. Maybe we should save that for the times that we're ready. But then, once we have that kind of explosive creativity and we have an insight, then stick with it. I don't know if there's anything wrong with that. So you make a list of things to do, or you get up in the morning having already decided what to do, or you have laws. Just think about what that means. A law, is that really so bad? Imagine what a society without laws would be. Laws are really, you could say, at least good laws, are just insights that have been codified and backed up by the power of the state. So that's my question. Like, is there a limit to choiceless awareness? And is that a bad thing, or is that a good thing if it's done in the right way?
Thank you for the question. Your question, by the way, is challenging and by itself. And I would not want to give an opinion on what Krishnamurti might say or comment, or on, I don't know if my opinion, if I may have one, if I could go away for a day or two and research it and think about it and come back to you with my own opinion, I don't know if that would be of any help to you. And what I would encourage is for you to mull that over and stay with it, and to see it as not something that needs to be judged. For example, I heard what you had to say, and I thought that sounds extremely reasonable to me. And who would I be to say you're on the right track or you're not on the right track? Your ability and capacity to delve into and explore Krishnamurti's teachings and understand them is something for you to explore in the context of your own experience and your own mind, which is your own. And I can't climb in there. So the two sides to that, and to my reluctance, is one is I'm not an expert on Krishnamurti, and I'm not the person to opine on Krishnamurti. And if on the other side you're simply interested in what I think, because I've sort of been a scholar engaged in the study of choiceless awareness, I'm not sure that my academic approach or my philosophical meanderings, whatever they might be, it sounds ultimately reasonable to me, and it's up to you basically to decide, which I think you've already done.
Hello. So I would just like to lay out some ideas that you brought up in your talk, and then sort of get your views on it. And hopefully, when I actually say it, it'll be clearer than my preface here. But there was this idea that there is a total change only when the observer is the observed at a certain point. And I think that I can see how that ties in with the stance that if we are making any sort of effort or we have a motive to change something in particular, that's antithetical to the state of being, which is what we call choiceless awareness. But I wonder, though, because there is a sense, and there's a very popular quote, and I don't know who it gets attributed to, but this idea that man is both the sculptor and the clay, right, in terms of self-improvement and these sort of ideas. And so I just wanted to get your opinion on, when I hear the question, and when you said it, and I had asked myself, why haven't I changed? That question at times puts me back into the space of viewing myself as the sculptor and the clay, rather than being one and the same. And so I wonder how you take the question of why haven't I changed, along with this notion that if we go wholeheartedly into this endeavor or try to attain this state of being so that we change, we're moving, it's like one step forward, 3 steps back, right? We'll be infinitely close but never actually arriving at this state of being. If I ask myself, why haven't I changed? Hope that makes sense.
Thank you for the question. It's a challenging one. In my limited knowledge and understanding and capacity for intelligence, I'm not sure that I can offer you a valuable response right on the spot. I'm not sure what I think about that notion that you raised, which sounds quite sophisticated, and obviously you've given it some thought. As far as my understanding of Krishnamurti's teachings, and it may not be the same as yours, I would, if I were to attempt to respond, or to see how I feel about what you feel, I would probably look at Krishnamurti's notion of what is. And what does he really mean by what is? What is the what is? And he talks a lot about the notion of fact. So if your perception of what's going on with us inwardly is that we create who we are, but on the other hand also influenced by what's around us and by our experiences, which makes sense to me in my experience, then we're talking about facts. We're aware of facts, and that's what is. So if I can live with that without judging that as either good or bad, I can consider myself to have agency and an opportunity to create my life as I go, which is, by the way, one of the views that I have in the way that I've interpreted my living of Krishnamurti's teachings. I create my life as I go. But I'm also, I sometimes, like I said before, I may get some feedback or criticism from others, and I react, sometimes in a defensive way. Now, I can start analyzing myself, or my brother would say, you should really go do some analysis. It's a really good thing to look at our childhood and analyze all that and do some archaeology into the psyche. I just have this kind of reluctance around it, so I haven't bothered much with it. But I accept the what is, and I don't know what the what is for you, but I'd be quite okay with just accepting that I'm one component of something that is being acted upon by something in my head and in my heart, but also from things I have absolutely no control of, and sometimes no awareness of even. And actually the same applies to stuff that comes inside me. Oftentimes I don't know where that comes from. So your metaphor of the clay and the sculptor, which is, by the way, the first time I've heard it, so thank you for sharing that with me. I might continue to think about that for a couple of days. I might even have an insight or some notion that might come in my head from somewhere in a couple of days. And then I would say to myself, darn, that's what I should have said to this very smart fellow. So that's all I have.
Well, I think we have time for one more question.
Can I go ahead? Mine is very brief. I heard the word challenge several times, so I jotted down some notes as far as what my recent challenges has taught me. So this is more of like a rhetorical question, if I may share. I wrote down the challenge in life only exists where resistance is imposed, whereas when one implicitly accept or allow what is occurring in the present instant or moment, there is no pain. And then I thought of the analogy of exercising like on a treadmill. When you actually increase the resistance, you actually feel the burn. And then the brain actually interprets that burn as pain. So therefore, we're supposed to, as we're exercising or as we're doing something, not necessarily impose that resistance, which is what induces that pain. And then I thought of the other analogy of water, where Bruce Lee gave a metaphor also where he said that water can flow or it can crash. And then he went on to elaborate on that. And we know that that is true. The body is made up essentially of water. And based on our emotions and how we are reacting to our external circumstances, that's basically what makes up who we are as an individual and what we experience or see in our reality. And when I went through my experience, I've been told I'm a rebel. My personality, I go always against the water per se. But that particular experience that I had over the last 17 years taught me how to just step back, to stop, and to just allow whatever is happening. And as I had continually did that, there was no pain. The way my brain was able to interpret things, it was not painful. I began to have the clarity of what was actually happening at the moment. And so the same way with water, if you dam up water, it's just being held back. But once that dam is released, we know the results of how the water would actually crash. And that's the way our life is. If we continue to put up a resistance, we interpret it as a challenge. But it's really not a challenge, is what I've come to learn.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks again, Jerry.
Yeah,
And thank you, everyone. We're going to take a moment and reset. And then coming up, we're going to be playing a Krishnamurti video. So we'll be back soon.
Here
Mhm.
in this place.